I was 19 when everything fell apart. One argument, one slammed door, and suddenly my sister and I were standing outside with nowhere to go. No plan, no safety net, just the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. At that age, you think you're ready for the world, until the world actually shows up. We didn't have many options, so we went to the only place that still felt like it belonged to us, our grandfather's old land. It had been abandoned for years, tucked away beyond a stretch of woods most people avoided. Growing up, Grandpa used to tell us stories about that place, especially about a cave hidden somewhere deep in the trees. Back then, it sounded like one of his wild adventures. Now it felt like our last chance. Finding the cave wasn't easy. It took hours of walking, arguing, and second-guessing ourselves. But when we finally saw it, half hidden behind overgrown vines and rock, it felt like more than just a place. It felt like we had discovered something meant for us. At first, it was just shelter. Cold, rough, and unfamiliar, we cleaned it, made a space to sleep, figured out how to survive day by day. But slowly, something changed. That cave stopped being a hiding place and started becoming a foundation. We learned things no one had ever taught us: how to rely on each other, how to solve problems, how to sit with fear without letting it control us. There were nights we wanted to give up, days when it felt unfair, like we had been pushed into a life we didn't choose. But in that isolation, we also found clarity. Without distractions, without expectations from anyone else, we began to understand who we really were. And then we found something unexpected: old journals, tools, traces of Grandpa's life we had never seen before. The cave wasn't just a shelter, it was a story, his story. A man who had built something with his own hands, who had chosen solitude not out of loneliness, but out of purpose. That realization changed everything. We stopped seeing ourselves as victims of what happened and started seeing ourselves as part of something bigger. That cave became a turning point, not because it saved us, but because it forced us to grow. It taught us resilience in a way no comfortable life ever could. Looking back now, getting kicked out at 19 felt like the end, but it was. It was the beginning of the hardest, most defining chapter of our lives. And that hidden cave, it didn't just give us shelter, it gave us direction, strength, and a sense of identity we didn't even know we were searching for. Being forced out at 19 is not just about losing a place to stay. It's about being pushed into a reality that most people only face years later. At that age, life still feels like something that is supposed to unfold gradually. There is usually an expectation of time to figure things out. Time to make mistakes safely, and time to lean on family when things go wrong. When that support suddenly disappears, it creates a shock that is both emotional and practical. One moment there is a sense of belonging and structure, and the next there is uncertainty, fear, and a constant awareness that survival now depends entirely on personal decisions. The emotional impact hits first. There is confusion, anger, and often a deep sense of rejection. It is hard not to question what went wrong or to replay the events that led to that moment. At 19, identity is still forming, and being told to leave can feel like a judgment not just on actions, but on worth as a person. That feeling can linger, creating self-doubt and making every decision feel heavier than it should. At the same time, there is pressure to stay strong, especially when not facing the situation alone. Having a younger or equally vulnerable sibling in the same position adds responsibility, making it necessary to suppress fear in order to provide some sense of stability. Beyond the emotional weight, the practical challenges are immediate and relentless. There is no time to fully process what happened because basic needs come first. Questions like where to sleep, what to eat, and how to stay safe take priority over everything else. Without preparation or resources, even simple tasks become complicated. Finding a safe place is not just about comfort, but about security. Managing money, if there is any, becomes a careful balancing act. Every choice carries consequences, and mistakes can quickly make an already difficult situation worse. At 19, most people are still learning independence in small steps. But being forced out accelerates that process dramatically. There is no gradual transition, no guidance, and often no safety net to fall back on. This sudden shift creates a kind of pressure that forces rapid growth. Skills that might have taken years to develop must be learned in days or weeks. Problem-solving becomes constant, and adaptability becomes essential. Even basic routines have to be rebuilt from nothing, which can feel overwhelming at first. Despite how harsh it is, this kind of experience also reveals strengths that might have otherwise remained hidden. When there are no easy options, creativity and determination begin to take over. Small victories, like finding a temporary place to stay or securing a meal, start to matter more than anything else. These moments build a sense of capability, slowly replacing fear with confidence. The realization begins to form that survival is possible, even in difficult circumstances. The presence of a sibling in the same situation adds another layer to the experience. It creates a shared struggle that can either strain the relationship or strengthen it. In many cases, it becomes a source of motivation. Knowing that someone else depends on you pushes you to keep going, even when giving up feels easier. It also creates a sense of partnership, where both individuals contribute in whatever ways they can, learning to rely on each other more than ever before. With nowhere else to turn, going back to their grandfather's land was not just a practical decision, it was an emotional one. When everything familiar had been taken away, that place remained one of the few connections to a time when life felt stable and safe. It was not perfect or even comfortable, but it carried memories that gave it meaning. In moments of uncertainty, people often reach for what feels known, and for them, that land represented a small piece of certainty in an otherwise unstable situation. The journey back itself carried a mix of hesitation and hope. It had been years since they had last visited, and there was no guarantee that it would still offer anything useful. Over time, nature has a way of reclaiming abandoned places, turning once familiar paths into overgrown trails and recognizable landmarks into something almost unnoticeable. As they made their way there, it likely felt like stepping into the past while also facing an unknown future. Every step forward came with the question of whether they were making the right choice. But with no better alternatives, it became the only choice that made sense. That land was more than just a physical space, it was tied to their grandfather's presence. Even in his absence, there was a sense that something of him still existed there. Memories of his voice, his stories, and the way he lived began to resurface as they arrived. These memories provided a kind of comfort that could not be found in unfamiliar places. It reminded them that they were not completely alone, even if he was no longer physically there. That emotional connection helped ease some of the fear and loneliness they were experiencing. At the same time, returning to that land meant facing reality. It was not a prepared home waiting for them, but rather a neglected area that required effort just to make it usable. There were no immediate conveniences, no guarantee of safety, and no clear plan for how things would work. The decision to go there was driven by necessity, but staying there required determination. It marked the beginning of a shift from relying on others to relying on themselves. The stories their grandfather had once told about the place took on new meaning. What once sounded like simple tales now felt like clues or guidance. In particular, the idea of a hidden cave, something that had seemed almost mythical before, became a real possibility worth searching for. It gave them a sense of direction, a small goal to focus on when everything else felt uncertain. Instead of being overwhelmed by their situation, they could concentrate on finding something that might improve their chances of getting through it. Returning to that land also created a space where they could think more clearly, away from the conflict that forced them out and the pressures of the outside world. They had room to process what had happened. The quiet of the environment, though initially unsettling, allowed them to reflect and begin to understand their situation in a different way. It was no longer just about what they had lost, but also about what they could build from this point forward. The discovery of the hidden cave did not happen quickly or easily. It was not a moment of luck where they simply stumbled upon it without effort. Instead, it came after hours of searching, uncertainty, and growing frustration. The stories their grandfather had once told about a cave somewhere on the land stayed in their minds. But without clear directions, those stories felt more like distant memories than reliable guidance. Still, with no better option and a need for shelter becoming more urgent, they decided to trust that those stories held some truth. The search itself was exhausting, both physically and mentally. The land had changed over time, with paths overgrown and landmarks no longer as recognizable as they once were. What might have been easy to find years ago had now become hidden beneath layers of nature reclaiming its space. Every direction they took seemed to lead to more questions than answers. There were moments when it felt pointless to keep going, when turning back seemed easier than continuing through uncertainty. But turning back would have meant returning to the same problem they were trying to solve, having no place to stay. As they moved deeper into the area, their focus sharpened. Small details started to matter more. They paid attention to unusual rock formations, shifts in the terrain, and anything that looked even slightly different from the rest of the landscape. The search became less about randomly wandering and more about observing carefully. This shift in mindset was important because it showed how quickly they were learning to adapt. They were no longer just reacting to their situation, they were actively trying to solve it. When they finally found the cave, it was not immediately obvious. It was partially hidden behind thick vines and natural rock, blending so well into its surroundings that it could easily be missed. At first glance, it might not have seemed like much, just an opening in the earth that had been forgotten over time. But as they looked closer, it became clear that this was what they had been searching for. The moment carried a mix of relief and disbelief. After all the uncertainty, they had found something real, something that could potentially change their situation. The cave was not perfect. It was dark, cold, and rough, far from anything that could be called comfortable. There were no signs of recent use, and it showed the effects of being left alone for years. Dust, debris, and the natural wear of time made it clear that it would take effort to make it usable. But despite its condition, it offered something they had not had before, a sense of protection. It provided a barrier from the outside world, a place where they could rest without constantly worrying about immediate danger. That moment of discovery marked a shift in their experience. Before finding the cave, everything had felt temporary and uncertain, as if they were constantly moving without direction. The cave changed that by giving them a fixed point, something they could return to and build around. It became more than just a physical space. It represented progress, proof that their efforts were leading somewhere meaningful. Emotionally, the discovery also brought a sense of hope. It showed them that even in a difficult situation, persistence could lead to results. The stories they had once heard, which seemed almost unrealistic, had guided them to something real and valuable. This connection to their grandfather added another layer of meaning, making the cave feel like more than just a slu chearakrakoi noye find. It felt intentional, as if it had been waiting for them to uncover it. Living in the cave was not just about having a place to stay. It became a daily test of endurance, patience, and adaptability. In the beginning, everything felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. The ground was uneven, the air was cold, and every sound seemed louder in the silence of isolation. There were no ready-made solutions, no instructions to follow, and no one to rely on except each other. Every day brought a new challenge, and each challenge demanded a response, whether they felt prepared or not. At first, even the simplest tasks required effort and thought. Figuring out where to sleep without discomfort, how to keep warm during colder nights, and how to organize their limited belongings became immediate concerns. These were things most people rarely think about, yet here they became essential parts of survival. Mistakes were inevitable, Some attempts to make life easier did not work, and sometimes those failures made things harder. But each mistake also carried a lesson, forcing them to adjust and try again with a better understanding of what worked and what did not. Over time, they began to develop routines. What once felt chaotic slowly turned into a system. They learned how to divide responsibilities, how to use their time more efficiently, and how to anticipate problems before they became serious. This process of trial and error strengthened their ability to think critically and act decisively. Instead of reacting with panic, they started responding with intention. That shift, though gradual, marked an important step in their growth. One of the most significant changes was in their mindset. In the early days, it was easy to focus on what they lacked. Comfort, security, and stability all seemed far away, and that sense of loss could feel overwhelming. But as they spent more time in the cave, their perspective began to change. They started to focus less on what was missing and more on what they could create with what they had. This shift did not remove the difficulty of their situation, but it made it more manageable. It allowed them to see possibilities instead of only limitations. Their bond as siblings also deepened during this time. Living in such close conditions meant they could not avoid each other, even during moments of frustration. Disagreements happened, and tensions sometimes built up under the pressure of their circumstances. But those moments also forced them to communicate more openly and honestly. They learned to listen, to compromise, and to support each other in ways they had not needed to before. The shared experience of hardship created a connection that went beyond ordinary relationships, turning them into true partners in survival. Fear was another constant presence, especially in the beginning. The isolation, the uncertainty, and the awareness of their vulnerability made it difficult to feel at ease. Nights were often the hardest, when darkness amplified every doubt and every sound seemed threatening. But as time passed, they became more familiar with their surroundings. What once felt dangerous started to feel predictable. That familiarity did not eliminate fear completely, but it reduced its power. They learned how to sit with it, to acknowledge it without letting it control their actions. Through all these experiences, resilience began to take shape. It was not something that appeared suddenly, but something that grew through repeated effort and persistence. Each problem they solved, each obstacle they overcame, added to a growing sense of capability. They started to trust themselves more, to believe that they could handle whatever came next. This confidence was not based on comfort, but on experience, which made it stronger and more lasting. The realization that emerged from their experience did not come all at once. It developed slowly, shaped by the days they spent in the cave and the challenges they faced along the way. In the beginning, their situation felt like something that had been forced upon them, something unfair and difficult to accept. It was easy to see themselves as victims of circumstances, reacting to events they could not control. But as time passed, their perspective began to shift. And that shift changed the meaning of everything they were going through. A key part of this transformation came from discovering traces of their grandfather's life within the cave. What they initially saw as just a shelter started to reveal deeper layers. Old tools, worn objects, and especially the journals he left behind told a story they had never fully understood before. These were not just random belongings, they were evidence of a life lived with intention. Their grandfather had not simply used the cave out of necessity, he had shaped it into something purposeful. That idea challenged the way they viewed their own situation. Reading his thoughts and seeing how he approached his life created a connection that went beyond memory. It allowed them to understand him not just as a figure from their past, but as someone who had also faced choices, struggles, and moments of uncertainty. He had built something meaningful in a place that others might have ignored or avoided. This realization carried an important message. It showed them that their current situation, no matter how difficult, also held the potential to become something meaningful if they chose to see it that way. This was the moment where their mindset truly began to change. Instead of asking why this had happened to them, they started asking what they could do with it. That shift may seem small, but it had a powerful impact. It moved them from a position of helplessness to one of control. They could not change the fact that they had been forced out, but they could decide how they would respond. The cave stopped being just a place of survival and started becoming a place of possibility. They began to see their actions differently. Cleaning the space, organizing their belongings, and improving their living conditions were no longer just tasks to get through the day. They became steps toward building something of their own. Each effort added a sense of ownership and purpose. They were no longer just passing time or waiting for circumstances to change. They were actively shaping their environment and, in turn, themselves. This realization also strengthened their sense of identity. Before, they had been defined by what happened to them, by being kicked out and left without support. Now they started to define themselves by how they handled that situation. They became individuals who adapted, who endured, and who created something from very little. That shift in identity brought a new kind of confidence, one that was grounded in real experience rather than assumptions about who they were. The connection to their grandfather added a deeper layer of meaning to everything they were doing. It felt as though they were continuing something he had started, even if in their own way. His presence, reflected through his belongings and his choices, became a source of guidance. It reminded them that a difficult path does not have to be an empty one. It can hold purpose, direction, and even a sense of fulfillment if approached with the right mindset.